Okay, so recently in Syria, there have been a very dangerous phenomenon currently unfolding. On one hand, there is the reality on the ground, which will be discussed in the first part of this event, the reality on the ground in Syria. And we have the latest report by the United Nations Commission of Inquiry in Syria, which says that the war against Syrian people continues unabated. We also have daily attacks on people in northern Syria. And there are tens of thousands of people who are still detained for the very same reasons that many of them have fled from Syria. As we know, many of these people are actually seen as enemies of the regime. And so there seems to be a parallel reality that is being projected and promoted by the Syrian regime, Russia, and an increasing number of people in the international community who claim that the only obstacle to the return of Syrians is repairing the damage in the infrastructure and providing reconstruction funds, which will solve the problem. And so the aim of this event is to discuss the true reality in Syria and how to get policymakers that make decisions that impact the lives of these people to change this reality. And to illustrate what I'm talking about, I would like to read to you the words of Abdul, who's 39, from Ha'il and Daraa, who returned in Syria in September 2020. And I'm taking this quote from the latest report by Human Rights Watch. And so Abdul says, in the first month after being tortured in detention, I couldn't walk properly. The bones are still broken, but the doctor is helping me. I can't work and can't go out alone. I will never leave my town now. I am scared of anything with a green color because it looks like the military uniforms. Those uniforms the military intelligence officers wore when they arrested and tortured me. I was in detention for 6 months. The terrorism I experienced in the jail is still with me now. I agreed to do this interview because I want people to know what happened to me when I returned to Syria. And so to discuss this issue further, today I have with me Nadia Hardman, who's refugee and migrant rights researcher at Human Rights Watch, Mary Forestier, who's a researcher and advisor on refugee and migrant rights in the MENA region at Amnesty, Fadel Abdelghani, who's the chairman and founder of the Syrian Network for Human Rights, and I am Haya Atassi, the media manager at the Syrian Association for Citizen Dignity. So I would like to start with Fadel, based on what I've said a while ago. Can you give us your diagnosis of the reality on the ground and what is life like in Syria right now, especially for the returnees?
Thank you very much, Haya, for organizing and for bringing all of us together in this important issue, which we believe that this discussion will continue for this stage and for the next one as well. And I'm delighted to be with my colleague Nadia and Mary, whom they are doing an amazing job in this regard as well. I believe that what's happening in Syria on a daily basis of violation against the population is the essential things in this regard, and this is I think this is the core of the problem. We still recording and documenting cases of extrajudicial killing at the rate of approximately 100 cases. They are killed. Extrajudicial killing per month, which is I think still the highest in all around the world. Of course, that we as a Syrian know that there is years, for example, 2012, the average was higher, but still this figure is shocked and still still at the top of the world. That extrajudicial killing happened due to many types of violating the right of living, indiscriminate bombing, death under torture, assassination, killing to people lost their life due to the landmine, due to several aspect of the conflict. By other hand, we still also documenting the arbitrary arrest cases, also at the rate which is approximately 200 cases per month as well. So the arbitrary arrest is higher than extrajudicial killing. We all know that the vast majorities of those arbitrary arrest, and we call, I think this also we call arbitrary, but it's like most likely kidnapped because there is no like any types of I can say legitimacy of doing this arbitrary arrest. We know how this arrest being committed in Syria. It's they took the person without even like saying whom they are or why. We are not talking about warrant judge warranty or something like this. We didn't reach to this level as well. So the vast majorities of those like transfer to be forcibly disappeared. And we know that almost, I can say almost all the detainees subjected to type of torture. Some of those also being forced recruitment. Now, the most of the cases of those arbitrary arrests are not referred to the regime court. If we are talking about the regime court or other types of court, like we can say that approximately 30% only who's referred to those court, and those court like approximately like we can say a branch of the security service. There is no types of any law subject to those court, the field court or the terrorist court. Like I don't think we have time to explain how is those court mechanism, but anyhow it's very well known. So here I'm talking about the loss of basic rights. That what is the resident subjected to. We are talking about those types of violation which is still widespread and systematic, still committed at this level. So the violation against the citizen actually is the main issue why preventing the refugees to return back. And not only the refugees, also the displaced people who's like few kilometers away. Martin Norman people, why they didn't back to their home? They are few kilometers away. Khan Sheikhoun city, it's almost empty because they know very well what is the citizen being subjected to. Regarding the refugees themselves, what's happened now? The regime actually considered the refugees themselves as like an enemy, and there is like here I think a good discrimination between the we need actually to have this discrimination for the sake of the refugees or the ITP, but mainly for the refugees, because the regime considered those as their enemy, especially those who is not visited or returned to Syria long time, many years ago. So why you left Syria? Why you didn't stood beside the security forces or the regime? This is in the regime mentality, and this is how the regime thinking. I think that, and that's what is the security forces telling the people, telling those refugees. So I think that the returned refugees will be more subjected to those types of violation, which is the citizen subjected to, in even an extra level. So that I think what's happened in Syria at the daily basis, those types of violation, the refugees will be subjected for the higher level, but the core things, as I mentioned, is that those violation is still committed as it's almost in 2011.
Thank you very much. Indeed, this is exactly the case. I would move to Nadia. So you published in your latest report, you published testimonies from returnees where they are explaining what they faced when they went back to Syria. Why do you think these people did go back, and can you describe what did they face from the testimonies that you got?
Thanks very much, Haya, and thank you very much for organizing this event today, this important event. Thank you to Fadl for setting out perfectly the context. And to Marie for her upcoming presentation as well. We spent a long time in our interviews asking people, the 65 Syrian refugees that I interviewed from this report who returned from Lebanon and Jordan to Syria, why they made this decision. So everyone I spoke to made a decision to go back. They were not deported by the authorities, although we can say in the context of Lebanon especially that these are coerced returns because the environment here in Lebanon is coercive for Syrian refugees. People are not given the means to live with restrictions on freedom of movement, access to basic services, and they don't have, more often than not, the legal right to be here, the legal papers, and they're subjected to arrest, harassment, and arbitrary deportation sometimes. So with that in mind, while we say that these are people who made the decision to leave, it's important to keep in mind the context in Lebanon. In Jordan, it's different. We don't see the same coercive environment. Across both countries, though, people talked about not having access to livelihoods, job opportunities, especially in the current context. Of course, again, Lebanon is not comparable. I mean, it's in a catastrophic financial situation, and 90% of Syrian refugees live in extreme poverty. But people said they wanted to go back to try and reclaim their land, to understand if, they could find their homes again, rebuild their lives inside Syria, because being a refugee in Lebanon is extremely difficult, and it's increasingly harder in Jordan as well. I think one of the major findings of our report, though, is that people didn't have access to the right kind of information. It simply isn't available what the reality is like, because people aren't going to find the information on safety and security inside Syria, and specifically in their area of origin. And so while we would think that they would rely on, family and friends networks to get that kind of information, it's simply not transmitted because it's extremely risky to do so. And of course, UNICR doesn't have access to or meaningful access to be able to report on return conditions. So with that misinformation in mind as well, people made this decision to return. Maybe I can just set out some of the figures. Out of the 65 people I spoke to, we documented 21 cases of arbitrary arrest and detention, 17 cases of enforced disappearance, 13 cases of torture, 5 extrajudicial killings, and I think it was 3 kidnappings, and 1 case of alleged sexual violence. Nearly everyone struggled to survive. So whether or not they faced a threat to their physical life or integrity, they couldn't live a life of dignity and with access to services, because they invariably went back and found their home partially or totally destroyed, unable to afford the costs of rebuilding, with the massive inflation as well of the Syrian pound, not enough resources to rebuild their lives. And this was also a major factor of why they couldn't establish themselves. Looking at the cases of the violations that people experienced, one of the things that we also encountered is that a lot of people I spoke to got security clearances or checked their names on wanted lists or entered into a reconciliation agreement. Sometimes they did all of these things to try to make sure that they would be protected on return. And what we found is that these documents, these extrajudicial documents, because it's not a legal process to get a security clearance. There's no regulation about this inside Syria, and we were very careful to check that with lots of lawyers. they don't provide the security that supposedly they're meant to. You know, I spoke to one man, a 32-year-old man from Homs here in Lebanon, who made the decision to return through the Lebanese organized returns process. And they do a security clearance for you. And so they security cleared his entire family, himself included, and he returned to Homs. And on the second day, he was picked up by the political security agency, was passed around 4 other security agencies during his time in detention, and was brutally tortured. And he showed me the signs of electrocution on his body. You know, he found out some time later that he was apparently being accused of terrorist acts. You know, was given documents to sign that he didn't have time to read or understand. And that's something we found generally, you know, with people who spoke about their time in detention. And of course, as Fadel knows most of all, that this has been a practice for you know, a long time. And the methods of detention, you know, the cruelty, the you know, barbarity in which they're implemented is, you know, we found the returnees face these same processes. And I'll just say one last thing. There's so much to say. I mean, I think the important thing to really underline is that we found no profile upon which, you know, people can make a prediction that they will face, you know, a human rights violation when they return. That is the point. There is no, you know, directed targeting. It is indiscriminate. You know, you cannot predict, and you cannot protect yourself through a security clearance, which is why we, you know, made this conclusion that Syria, all parts of Syria are not safe. And we call, you know, on all Syrian host refugee nations for an immediate halt and moratorium on all forced returns to Syria. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadia. Actually, we're going to get to the part of the UNICR and their role in return. And with regards to people not knowing the reality of the situation in Syria, I want to mention that in our latest report, we did a survey with Syrians in Assad-held areas, and 50% of the people indicated that they do not feel safe. 64% of the returnees said that they do not feel safe, and 94% of people in reconciliation areas do not feel safe. So the percentage of people who live in Assad-held areas, and interestingly, even people who never left, they also don't feel safe. I want to move to Mary, but Mary, first I want to read a quote from your report. In one of the testimonies in the report, there's Noor, who says that she recounted that a Syrian officer told her at the border when she was crossing from Lebanon. He told her, "Why did you leave Syria? Because you don't like Bashar al-Assad, you don't like Syria." He told her, "You're a terrorist." He told her that Syria is not a hotel that you leave and return to when you want. And then he subsequently raped Noor, and he raped her 5-year-old daughter. So there were a lot of these really devastating testimonies which we read in your report. And so based on these testimonies, how do you describe the situation of the people who are returning back to Syria, to Assad areas in Syria?
Thank you, Aya. And I just want to say that the quote you read, this was told to this lady we called Noor in the report. It was also told to other people. It was not an exception, just one thing that was told to one returnee. This accusation of leaving the country because people supposedly didn't support the government came over and over again. So it was not just one quote. And so that's why, to answer your question, the situation in Syria for refugees returning is so difficult and so dangerous. It's because they are considered, because they left the country, as opponents, as Fadel was explaining earlier, and as Nadia was saying, there is no profile of people at risk. There is no profile because the simple fact of having left the country is enough for the Syrian government to believe that these people are opponents, because they believe they didn't want to stay to defend the country. So because of this widespread suspicion of being an opponent, people, when they return, face very serious human rights violations. And Amnesty's report's findings are very similar to Human Rights Watch report finding that Nadia highlighted, even though we interviewed totally different people. So we found that when people are returning, the situation for them is that they are at real risk of persecution. They are at real risk of suffering sexual violence. You described the horrific story of Noor and her young daughter, but it happened to another boy. Among the cases I documented, it also happened to men. There is a case of this man who returned, and he was beaten when he was detained, and the officer who beat him told him he was beaten on his genitals, and the officer who beat him told him, "We are beating you here so that you cannot bear children who will harm you, who will harm the country as you harm the country." So this is very self-explanatory. So beyond the sexual violence, and again, that came up in a very alarming high number of cases among our investigation. Detention, arbitrary and unlawful detention, is also very common. We documented 59 cases of detention. So whether at the border crossing when people were arrested and taken to intelligence detention centers, or a few days after returning, maximum a few weeks after returning, people were refugees returning were arrested and detained in intelligence facilities, and it affected men, women, and also children. We documented 2 cases of pregnant women who were detained, 10 cases of children who were detained, and the majority of these children were below 4-year-old, because what happens is that they are taken with their mother. Also, another type of abuse is enforced disappearances. We document 27 cases who were forcibly disappeared. For instance, there is this family who returned from France. They returned via Lebanon, and as soon as they crossed the border with Lebanon, they were arrested, the 2 parents and the 4 children and young children. And since then, they have been disappeared. It has been 2.5 years, and their family have no news. Also, among the people who were disappeared, 5 of them reportedly died in custody. Their family was notified that their relatives died in custody. And finally, as it has unfortunately been the case since the beginning of the conflict in Syria, there have been a high number of cases of torture. So people who return when they are detained have been tortured. It is the same type of torture we've seen in Syria since the beginning, the same method, the same tools. So it really strictly followed the pattern we unfortunately know. And because of this situation, because of what returnees face, their first move when they can is to leave the country again. None of among the cases I documented, all of those who were able to flee the country again did so. So in the end, it's only 1/3, because not all of them were able to, for various reasons I won't go into now. But no one felt safe enough to return. And so that's very telling in itself. For people who return from Rukban, the fact that they prefer to go back to Rukban rather than staying in Syria is also self-explanatory. And finally, I would like to say that the situation for women who are returning is not better than for men. There is this belief that women will be less at risk because they don't have to do the military service, maybe, or I don't know for which reasons, but they are not. I want to highlight that women are as much at risk as men, and yes, they would face violations even if they return without a male relative. So that's a short overview of the situation for refugees returning to Syria.
Okay, I'm sorry. I think I lost my connection for a while. Thank you very much, Mary. And we're going to get to the part where Syrians are actually forced to leave again, because this has ramifications which we need to discuss. But before we go on, I just would want to mention to our participants that their questions are welcome via chat, so they can write to us their questions in chat, and we're going to read them to our guest speakers by the end of our session. So now that we described the reality in Syria, and specifically in the areas under the regime's control, on the other hand, there's another reality that the Syrian regime and Russia are presenting, where they are creating some sort of a parallel reality that Syria is safe for return and we have to encourage Syrians to return, and they are holding conferences for that and trying to attract funds for reconstruction, claiming that reconstruction is the main obstacle for the return. And unfortunately, some countries do actually believe, or if they don't believe, they are actually following in those steps. And I want to quote here what Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov said a couple of weeks ago, that the United Nations Security Council resolution has to do with the need for the West to stop attempts to obstruct plans to create conditions for the return of refugees to Syria. Unfortunately, the West is not raising money, except with the aim of keeping these refugees in countries to which they fled in the early years of the conflict. And above all, Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey, and he does not want to do anything to rebuild the structure. And I would like to ask Abel, what, I mean, as a Syrian, when he hears this, when he sees that the talk about return to Syria is just, you know, construction and all of that, where do you see the danger of the promotion of this reality and this narrative by the regime and the calls to, you know, to accept the regime and to normalize with it again?
I don't think that the Syrian regime care about the return of refugees at all. On contrary, the regime, like, who's the one who put all those obstacles against the return of refugees? We have like tremendous laws that's violating the HLP, and so all of those like violation committed by the regime. On contrary, the regime like pushing Syrian to be refugees actually, by committing those violations or to be subjected to his dictatorship. I think that this is the Russian desire. Even the conference held in Damascus, I think that coming from based on the Russian request, like aiming to pressurize the Western country, blackmailing like them, and mobilizing the extreme right, and that's somehow actually succeed. Unfortunately, we saw how Russia blackmailed and how invested, actually, I can say, in the human rights case, like refugees case. We saw what's happened on the border of Belarus. Actually, Russia aimed to say, what is the Russia aim? That's the next point. They are aimed to say, if the refugees return, that means Syria is safe. So let's start the reconstruction process. There is also other like theory that Russia trying to build, and I hear it unfortunately from some Western diplomat, which is a bit surprised for me and shocked, that the Russians said, and he didn't say the Russia, but I think also this, what the Russian is trying to spread. They said, if the construction process begin, especially the hospitals and the facilities, the refugees will return. What is prevent them to return? That those facilities are destroyed. Okay, they forgotten that those being destroyed by Russian forces, shilling the regime forces, and Russia is a rich country. Why also they are not support or engage in the reconstruction? They want to destroy, and they want the other to rebuild, and they want to seek benefit from this build, from UN aid, from all of that. So also, by other hand, and this also the argument also, we can like say why Russia didn't like provide any guarantee to the refugees when they are being back, not to be subjected for arbitrary arrest, torture, forced conscription, and all of those types of violation. So that actually leads me to I think that pressure the countries of, this is the third point of your question. There is actually a pressure on the regional countries, which they are around Syria, economically and all of that. And I think that, okay, they are committed somehow violation against the refugees, which being documented. But by other hand, there is also here a responsibility from the vast majorities of states around the world to resettle the refugees. They are now, some of those regional countries, they are forcing refugees, Syrian refugees, to return back to different territories, regimes control area at the Jordanian border, or at the north to opposition held area. I think Syria, all Syria is not safe. And the perpetrator is acting similarly. So of course, the regime committed the vast majority of crimes, and they have state institution like security forces and army. But I do believe, as my colleague mentioned, and as my colleague at the Commission of Inquiry said, all Syria is not safe. So I think that there is, and here we need actually to keep talking about the responsibility of the other state. So to resettle these refugees, which is, we are monitoring and seeing this process is very much poor, unfortunately. The last point, I'm sorry I took much time in this question. The European countries, I think, should learn from Belarus lesson, what's happened, and should engage more to solve the root of the conflict and to reach to an end of, because the generation, the reason generation, the generate of the refugees, the root and the cause of generate refugees is still exist. So the refugees will be increased, not decreased, because this conflict took so much. And I think the European countries does not engage that much in solving the root of the refugees generation or generating. And they, in this regard, they need to pressurize also the countries. And I think this is the lead us to maybe the next question, or maybe I can talk later about the normalizing with Assad regime. That means none of the refugees at all, the refugees or ITP, I can assure you 13 millions will not gonna to return at all to Syria. No, that's the definition of normalization with Assad. Normalization with Assad, that means normalization with crimes against humanity and war crime, total impunity. Maybe we can talk further. Sorry, I took much time.
Thank you very much. Indeed, very valid point. The questions you raised at the beginning to Russia, as in why doesn't it guarantee the commitment, and especially what we witnessed in reconciliation areas, these are very valid questions, of course. I want to move to Nadia. Was in your latest report, in the recommendations, you mentioned that the UNICR must not promote or facilitate voluntary repatriation of Syrian refugees from Jordan, Lebanon, and other host countries, so as long as conditions for safe and dignified return are not in place unsustainable. And my words are, we have seen the UNICR Chief Filippo Grandi admitting that they are coordinating with the Assad regime for the return of the displaced Syrians. And he even went as far as saying that he placed faith in the regime to ensure the safety of the returnees. So how do you explain the insistence by the UNICR to coordinate with the very regime, which is Fadl mentioned now, who is responsible for the displacement of more than half of Syria's population?
Thank you very much, Haya, for the question. Look, I can't, as Human Rights Watch or as Nadia Hadman, impute what UNHCR is thinking or doing in its tweets, for example, because I think you're referring to specifically Grandy's tweets after his visit to Damascus, and these tweets referred to returns and creating conditions for return and removing obstacles for return. And of course, one thing I can say is that we are concerned by that language, very concerned, and it flies in the face of the position that UNHCR is still still maintains that Syria is not safe and it is not organizing or facilitating returns. And that is still the case. That is, they are not doing that. The only thing that UNHCR will do is provide, counseling, protection counseling to someone who wants to go back. So this kind of one-to-one voluntary, assistance, but it's not facilitating. And it's important to remember that, but of course we are alarmed, I would say, by these statements. As I said, I can't guess what they are doing when I don't know for sure, but I understand that Grandy was here in Lebanon, where I'm based, and of course the conditions in Lebanon, as my colleagues were also saying, are dire, and 90% of Syrian refugees live in extreme poverty. And as I said at the beginning, the environment for Syrian refugees here is coercive. It is extremely difficult. But still, as Fadil pointed out, people do not want to go back. They still cite safety and security as their number one concern. And even though I spoke to people who made the decision to return, that's still very small numbers. So if you can imagine that they are still preferring to stay in a country like Lebanon right now, because they do not want to go back and be targeted by the regime that they fled from in the first place. And this is something which, despite the economic conditions inside Lebanon and difficulties in Jordan, and the fact that 10 years on, yes, we're protracted displacement, but the reality just hasn't changed. And until that shifts in any kind of meaningful way, and that we can guarantee safe and dignified returns, then we cannot move away from this position, and UNHCR cannot, and hopefully will not move from their position that Syria is not safe for return. We can talk later maybe about the European shifts with a couple of member states, but yeah, maybe I'll leave it there for the moment.
Yeah, thank you very much. I want to move to Mary, and speaking of the European countries where Nadia ended, one of the problems that Syrians are facing in Europe is specifically in Denmark, the decision to withdraw protection. And we recently did an interview with a Syrian refugee in Denmark who's almost 60 years old. He has been separated from his son and sent to a deportation center in preparation for him to leave Denmark and to go back to Syria, to an unsafe Syria, which is really a tragic story. And we know many Syrians in Denmark are facing such fate. What do you think led to the Danish authorities to make such assessments and to put the lives of those people at danger? How do you explain this?
Well, what I understood from Danish authorities is that they base mainly their assessments on the military criteria. Basically, for them, the rationale is that military hostilities have faded down, have reduced. Like putting it in a blunt way, there are no bombs falling on Damascus. So it is enough for them to assess that it is safe. And this is why we argue at Amnesty International, we are asking countries to include the criteria of respect of human rights into the assessment of the safety of an area. And also something else, that is important, that echoes what Fadil was saying, is that the Syrian government is in control of of Damascus and of other of these areas. And this is the reason, the reason why a refugee fled in the first place is to escape the threats and the crimes committed by the Syrian government. So the fact that it is still in control is by no way a guarantee of safety. and we should also keep in mind that the strategy of the Syrian government since the beginning of the conflict has been to empty the country of its opponents. So again, this is an additional concern for the safety and in this safety assessment. And also another issue is the issue of information. Refugees don't have enough information to assess whether an area is safe for returning or not. So this is slightly different from Europe. This is like when it is an individual decision. But there is this case of this man who returned from Jordan with his mother and his children. And as soon as he crossed into Syria, he was arrested, detained for 6 months, tortured during his detention. And just after he was released, he called his cousin, who he spoke to before returning to Syria, and he asked his cousin, "Why didn't you tell me on the phone that it was like this? Why didn't you say anything?" And his cousin said, "Well, I'm sorry, I couldn't speak freely on the phone, and I'm sorry I misled you." So that's also something very important to keep in mind. There is no such thing as informed return as at the moment.
Well, I think this is precisely one of the problems that needs to be addressed, and we as an association have written a lot about the importance that the UNICR takes lead on this. The UNICR must do its best to inform the Syrians of the situation before they return, because yes, we do strongly believe that the Syrians are completely misled and they are not aware of the situation before returning back to Syria. And so it is the responsibility, whether of UN agencies or of any institutions who are working in this domain, to actually inform the people and then let them make the decision for themselves. But obviously, we have to tell them that the situation is not safe. And from here, I would move to our last section from my questions, and then we can take the questions of our guests. I want to go back to Fadl and your latest October report, because you issue monthly reports. On your October report, you stress that the UN and the guarantor parties at Astana should form an impartial special committee to monitor cases of arbitrary arrest and revealing the fate of 102,000 missing persons in Syria, 85% of them detained by the same regime. And you also add that pressure should be applied on all parties to immediately review their detention records in accordance with a timetable, and allow humanitarian organizations like the International Committee of Red Cross to have direct access to them. And my question is, with these recommendations in mind, how do you describe the participation of some international organizations who are supposed to do this monitoring in the last follow-up meetings on return with the Syrian regime and Russia? How do we get them to act on your recommendations at the time when they are actually engaging in normalization?
Thanks, Haya, for this question. We think that Asitana is a military track, is not a political one or not a human rights track. Asitana has not succeeded at all in revealing the fate of the disappeared person, as you mentioned. Still, this 102,000 still disappeared till this moment, which is like a huge figure, and which is also again put Syria in the worst country around the world who is suffering from the disappearance at this stage. And also they didn't succeed at least revealing their fate, not releasing. We are not talking about this stage. So and in Asitana, what's happened? Prisoner exchange with no criteria. So based on that, we are calling again the international organization, our partner, and to supervise the outcome of those meetings and criticize clearly any recommendation on any outcome opposite the human rights. Somehow, and as you mentioned, maybe there is they are sending or spreading this feeling that there is prisoner exchange happening. There is this process, and that type of normalization normalization with Assad. So, and Russia built on this. I think that normalization should be always linked with the political transition toward democracy, and should always be linked to respect of the human rights. That's the meaning of normal. Otherwise, if the regime still committed the crimes against humanity, which he is still doing in many types of violation, mainly torture and forced disappearance, so that normalization, it's type of support, and support regime or government who's committed crimes against humanity is violation of the international law. And that's what we want this message to be clear by our partner, and also repeated while we are seeing this movement toward normalizing with Assad at the expense of the refugees' right, the citizen right, and also that mean erasing all what Assad did in past 10 years, including killing thousands of Syrians under torture, disappeared tens of thousands using chemical weapons, all of that. Finally, I do think that the ICRC can, like, I think they can, like, do much more effort than what they are doing in Syria. And finally, Sitana like failed to like at least guarantee access for the ICRC for all the perpetrator-centered detention. So none of the parties allow this visit to happen. Thank you.
Thank you. So definitely, the normalization with the regime should not happen unless there is a halt to all the acts of violation of human rights. Because, like you said, it's not possible to normalize with such a regime which commits these crimes. And this brings me to the question I will ask Mary. So we are witnessing how Syrians are throwing themselves in the sea and sleeping in open air, and to escape the hell of life under the Assad regime. And the latest events at the Belarus border prove how desperate these people are, where they are simply asking for safety and for dignity, which are rights that no human should ever be deprived of. And so European countries must be aware of the gravity of the situation, which doesn't end at the Belarus border. And so how do you explain the importance that countries understand the danger of premature return, and how would it impact them? So it's not enough to send Syrians back, because they should understand that this will actually have another impact on these host countries themselves. How can you describe this?
Well, first of all, the most important point is that European countries must grant refugee protection to refugees, and not only subsidiary protection. So the highest level possible of protection, and a durable one, because we see that it's not time for people to return, and the risk they face. So the Syrian refugees definitely qualify for this level of protection. So that's if there were only one message for European countries, that would be this one. Also, I would like to stress what I mentioned earlier, is that women are as much at risk, and therefore should be granted the same level of protection as men. We saw some cases in Denmark where a family had their permits reassessed, their residency permit reassessed, and I have a case in mind, an example in mind, where the son, a young man, had his residency maintained, while his mother and his sister had their residency revoked. And that's a total misunderstanding of what is happening in Syria and the risk people face. His mother and his sister would be as much at risk as him. So that's also something very important for European countries to understand. The other issue, also we talked about it a bit, so I won't go into details, is the issue of information. European countries must realize that there is not enough information to make an informed decision for refugees to return. And finally, in the light of all these findings and all the discussion we've been having, European countries should increase the resettlements for Syrian refugees and share and like take their part of responsibility and show solidarity with Syrian people, because countries in the region, Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, face great challenges and have made efforts hosting Syrian refugees. So there should be more solidarity from European countries.
Thank you. And I would also want to add that it is very dangerous to force people to go back, because like I think Nadia mentioned earlier, that many of either Nadia or you, that they are trying to leave again. So these people, when they go back, they are trying to leave again. And the problem with them leaving again is that they would never ever consider to go back, even if we convince them later on that the situation is safe. These people would never ever trust going back, and this in itself is really dangerous, because we believe that Syrians at some point they have to return to Syria when the situation is safe, and we want the Syrian refugees to return, but we don't want them to lose trust in return when the situation is safe for them to return. And this is an issue which really is very important to keep in mind. My question now is for Nadia. So. In your report, you also recommended an immediate moratorium on all forced returns of Syrians to all parts of Syria. And while active hostilities have decreased in recent years, but the situation is fluid and relative periods of stability fail to meet the basic conditions for safe, voluntary, and dignified return. And so, with countries like Lebanon, Denmark, and Jordan who are considering premature return, what do we do to make policymakers and host countries accept that the safe environment is the only way to ensure that there can be a safe return to the Syrians?
Thanks, Haya. We do events like today. We continue to push refugee voices and returnee voices forward. You know, it's extremely sensitive for the returnees that I spoke with to speak out publicly, especially, of course, the ones that were subjected to human rights violations inside Syria. You know, so what organization like ours and colleagues can do is amplify those voices, those experiences, put the testimony forward. And, you know, of course, we will continue to do briefings at all levels, you know, missions to capitals, and really just make sure that the recommendations reach the people that they're meant to. But it's just really important to keep on hammering the message home to make sure that these reports are read, and that consultations, I mean, the most important thing is to consult with Syrian refugees themselves, which is what it does happen. You know, there is monitoring, there's protection monitoring out there, there's intentions data, which says Syrian refugees do not intend to return because they consider safety and security as the primary barrier. So that has to be taken seriously. You know, 10 years on, it doesn't matter. If conditions are not right for return, it's not safe, it's not dignified, it's not informed, then we need to continue to push for humanitarian funding in Syrian refugee host nations and continue resettlement numbers of places in Europe. I mean, the worry that we have is that funding appeals will shift towards returns preparedness prematurely. And this is what we're really calling not to happen. Just because, you know, we've reached this margin of a decade, just because there are signs of normalization, does not change the reality on the ground. So yeah, we will continue and with your organizations and others to amplify these messages as much as possible.
Thank you very much. I have one last question from my side, and then we'll move to the questions on the chat. So the Syrian Association for Citizens published a report that is on the weaponization of aid. I'm addressing this question to Fadl, but anyone is free to answer. On weaponization of aid and in assault-hit areas, and how there are methods and mechanisms used by the regime to manipulate aid and direct it for its own interests. And in recommendations of many of the reports, which I read from Human Rights Watch, from Amnesty, and even from your reports, there are always recommendations that donor countries must ensure that these funds are going to the right place and that these funds are actually contributing to save these Syrians and to improve their livelihoods. But our reports actually have shown that, and according to the testimonies from people who worked in international organizations, in Syrian organizations, and UN agencies in Syria, that the regime has direct control of aid that's entering Syria. And so how will it be possible to monitor aid in areas under the control of the regime while the regime controls this aid in the first place? I mean, this is actually a bit of a really complicated situation. How do you think this is possible?
Thank you, Haya. You always raising complicated question. This, unfortunately, this matter we are discussing, and since 2014, in spite of all revealing reports, scandals, mistakes, still being repeated, it happened, and still the regime succeed in blackmailing and stealing the aid. The regime actually consider the detainees, consider actually, I can say, the citizen, the Syrian citizen, even the state as a hostage. And in order to pass aid, they have to steal 90% or maybe more, as the report revealed. And I think that the most comprehensive report is regarding the system did by our colleague Sarah Kayali, and if that report in 2019, and there is also other previous report in 2015 and all of that, but still, and your report, Haya, and still, what is the main recommendation? This is what we need to do to as possible as we can, and I think we can. I think that establishment of the platform, coordination platform for mainly the donors. The donors has to create this platform in mainly the state and including the UN and the biggest organization. If this platform being established, there is platform. But those scattered platform, many platforms, there is actually, and there is a coalition, and there is a coordination, coordinating, but those are not who's everyone. We don't want everyone, but at least the major one is there is not that much coordination. Why? Because if those are union, the blackmailing and the stealing from Assad regime and the organization who created to steal this aid, it will eliminate so much, because here the bargaining, it will take other direction. The regime is one side, and those organization, all the regime created is one side, but he has many different platform, or so he's blackmailing. But if there is a new union, the blackmailing and the stealing will eliminate, I think, so much. That doesn't establish till now, after all of those years and failure. I hope that some movement took place, especially after we saw the Russia blackmailing on the cross-border resolution, and how's every renewal, we noticed how the Russian want something in return, in exchange to allowing the aid, the neutral aid, the neutral UN aid to pass to the displaced people who's mainly displaced by Russia and regime Chile. What a world we are living in.
That's true. And I remember when there was a campaign on the cross-border aid, and we have said this, and you have said this, and other institutions have said that the humanitarian aid to Syria should not be politicized. It should not be bound to the blackmailing of Russia at the Security Council. And there are actually legal ways for aid to be delivered to Syria without the approval of the Security Council. So yes, we'd actually call upon the donor countries to take this path and not allow the Russian blackmailing. I will take a few of the questions that we have in our chat. There's a question that's to all of the speakers, so anyone is free to answer it. So it says there are increasingly frequent reports of European states looking for ways to direct their funding to early recovery and finding ways to normalize the status quo without any change in the security situation. How can we advocate against such creeping acceptance of premature return on a larger scale? What can organizations such as those gathered here do to prevent this from happening? Anyone would like to answer? No.
I'm happy to answer, Haya.
Okay, sure.
I mean, it's probably a bit of a repetition of what I said before. Of course, funding discussions, we don't attend discussions with humanitarian organizations and donors, about allocations of funding, but they rely on reports, public reports, such as ours and Amnesty's and the Syrian Network for Human Rights. So now that these reports are coming out, and there are many others out there from other organizations, describing the human rights situation that continues to be dire, and now what happens to refugee returns, we hope that this will make it into the proposal draw-ups of what funding and programming should look like, i.e. not returns-based programming, but continuing protection and humanitarian programming. So we don't move towards a normalization because people are suddenly now talking about what do we need to do to remove obstacles for return. The major obstacle for return is the Assad regime itself. And until that changes, then, it's going to be extremely difficult to talk about anything like safe, dignified, and voluntary returns.
We have a question here about, I don't know if this is very relevant to the session, but what information is available to speakers about the process of demographic change that the Syrian regime is carrying in a number of sensitive areas in Syria? I don't know if anyone would like to address this issue right now. I don't know if Fadl would like to address this issue.
Yeah, demographic change, we highlight this issue, that part of the forced displacement. But demographic change or the engineering change is bigger than that. Happened that took place in. Of course, it can be linked also to the refugees, because mainly lots of displaced people, IDP, move to be refugees or seek refugees because they lost their houses. It's been destroyed, they've been displaced. But we recorded some massacres took place based on sect issues, so that somehow, mainly in Homs actually, somehow that lead to a demographic change, which is it's not that much easy to prove. Actually, we shed a light on that. But the massacres is, of course, lead to the people being terrified to return, and none of them actually being returned. Some interior family being erased and killed, so they've been terrified. I cannot consider that as or describe that in whole Syria. It's happened in specific incident in specific neighborhood.
Thank you very much. So there are two questions about the UNICR, but I think we already covered them in the discussion. One final question I will take, which asks, why aren't the areas in the north under Turkish control considered safe? If Mary and Nadia would like to answer, if not, maybe Fadl can touch upon this. Why are these areas not considered safe? This is what is being asked. Okay.
I can jump in, but always I'm jumping in.
It's okay, feel free.
Go for it, Fadl. I can add a little bit after.
Okay, thank you, Nadia. Thank you for your support. They are not safe. Actually, we published a lot of reports about the violation of Hayat Tahrir Sham, about the National Army, mainly like what's happened in like torturing and some activists, and we recorded also some cases who's died due to this torture. So some like how a violation being recorded. So that means, and this is the core of the definition of the refugees, who's like afraid from this suppression of his life. So he's seeking refugees, and this is his right. Force returning him, that means you're violating his basic right. And those forces controlled area, PYD, SDF, also committed several types of violation, including conscription, including arbitrary arrest, disappearance, similar to Assad regime, but the scale is different to be objective. But those are still exist and considered as a threat. And there is no jurisdiction system, all of that. We published many reports about those parties, and in our general report, there is we keep recording like what I mentioned at the beginning of this conference. The figures I mentioned, those committed by all parties. The average of 200 arbitrary arrests, the 100 of extrajudicial killing, and different types of violation. So those are committed by all parties. We still recorded cases from all of them, and I think those areas are not safe to the refugees to return back.
Nadia, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I mean, my only addition, I think everything is said in Fadl's reply. We for the report, we only spoke to people who returned to government-controlled areas. So we didn't, and I believe Amnesty is the same, didn't interview refugees who returned to non-government controlled areas. So our findings flow from those. But the audience have a good and strong answer from Fadl.
Thank you very much. There's a question, very long question in Arabic about the Russian role, but I think we already addressed it very well, the Russian role in promoting a premature return. So I think that's it for today. I think personally it was a very interesting conversation, very important conversation as well. And I really want to thank all of my guests today, Fadl Abdelghani from the Syrian Association for Human Rights, Mary from Syria, from Amnesty International, and Nadia Hardman from Human Rights Watch. It was a pleasure being with you today. Thank you so much and hope to see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining.
Bye.